The portrait was small enough to fit in a man's palm, painted on a thin oval of ivory no bigger than a pocket watch, and Benjamin Reed had pressed his thumb across its surface so many times in 3 years that the edges of the image had begun to soften. The painted woman's features worn slightly at the corners, as if even her likeness had grown tired of waiting. He pulled it out now, standing in the dust of the main street of Harlan's Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, and looked at it the way a man looks at something he has memorized so completely that he no longer fully sees it. The woman in the portrait had dark hair piled carefully above a long, graceful neck. Her eyes, rendered in tiny, careful brushstrokes of brown and amber, held a quality the painter had somehow managed to capture that Benjamin had never been able to name exactly. It was not sadness. It was not happiness either. It was something in between, something that lived in the space between one thing and the next, like the pause before a storm, like the held breath of a person deciding whether or not to speak. He had been given the portrait by her uncle, a land agent named Gerald Talmadge, who had come through Abilene 3 years prior seeking a buyer for a parcel of land out near the Llano Estacado. Benjamin had been working cattle drives out of Abilene then, a marshal's deputy by title but a cowboy by everything else, his boots worn through at the heels and his hands rougher than creek stone. Gerald Talmadge had been stuck in town for 2 weeks waiting on paperwork, and in that time, the two men had formed the particular kind of friendship that only comes from shared boredom in a small place. It was Gerald who had first mentioned his niece. Not in any calculating way, not as a transaction, but the way a man mentions the best thing in his life when he is far from it and lonely. He had said her name the way people say the name of a town they grew up in and left and miss every day without knowing quite why they miss it. Edna Talmadge. 22 years old, he had said, living in San Antonio with her widowed mother, working in a dressmaker's shop, reading every book she could find, writing letters to her uncle that were so full of intelligence and wit that Gerald laughed aloud every time one arrived. "She is the kind of woman," Gerald had said one evening over a tin of coffee and a fire that was doing its best against the plains wind, "who makes every room feel like it is missing something once she has left it." Benjamin had not said much in response. He was not a man who said much in general, but something in him had shifted when Gerald spoke of her. Some quiet internal arrangement of things had rearranged itself, and he had not known what to make of that. Then Gerald had shown him the portrait. He had taken it from his vest pocket with the careful reverence of a man handling something precious, and handed it across the fire to Benjamin, who held it close to the firelight and looked at the painted face of Edna Talmadge for the first time. She looked back at him from the ivory oval, calm and considering, and Benjamin Reed, who had ridden cattle trails through 3 states and faced down armed men without his pulse rising appreciably, felt something move through him that he could only compare to the feeling of stepping off a riverbank into cold water, the sudden full-body recognition that the ground had changed beneath him. He had handed the portrait back. Gerald had tucked it away. And 2 days later, Gerald Talmadge had ridden out of Abilene with his paperwork finalized and his land sold, and he had pressed the portrait into Benjamin's hand at the last moment and said, "I have 2 of her. Keep this one. Maybe one day you will find yourself in San Antonio." Benjamin had meant to send the portrait back. He had meant to do a great many things in the 3 years that followed. Gerald Talmadge had died in the fall of 1880, less than a year after leaving Abilene. A fever, someone wrote in a letter that found Benjamin through a chain of forwarding addresses and dust-covered post offices. The letter was from a man named Horace Deal, Gerald's business partner, and it informed Benjamin that Gerald had spoken of him favorably, and that if he was ever in San Antonio, there was a standing offer of work at Deal and Associates Land Agency. Benjamin had read the letter 4 times. He had looked at the portrait for a long time after, and then he had made a decision that should have been simple and had somehow taken him another 1.5 years to act upon, because life on the plains had a way of requiring everything a man had and leaving no room for anything else, especially not the soft and terrifying things. But now it was April of 1882. He was 30 years old. He had ridden south from Abilene with everything he owned in 2 saddlebags and the portrait in his breast pocket, close to his heart in the most literal sense. And Harlan's Creek was the last stop before San Antonio, which was 2 more days south through the hill country if the weather held and his horse stayed sound. He put the portrait back in his pocket and walked into the dry goods store to buy provisions for the last stretch of the journey. The dry goods store smelled of coffee and sawdust, and the particular sweet sharp scent of dried meat. There was a woman behind the counter, older, with her gray hair pinned tight and her expression pinned tighter, and a young man sweeping the floor in the corner who stopped sweeping when Benjamin walked in and watched him with the alert curiosity of someone who had not seen much of the world yet and wanted to. Benjamin bought hardtack, dried venison, a small sack of cornmeal, and a tin of coffee. He asked about the road south and was told it was passable, but that there had been a stretch of flooding near the Frio River that had washed out a section of trail, and riders were detouring east by about 4 miles to find the crossing. He thanked the woman, picked up his goods, and went back out into the afternoon light, which was golden and thick with pollen and the smell of horses, and the particular clarity of a Texas spring day when the sky has scrubbed itself blue, and everything is very sharp and very present. He was tying his provisions to his saddlebags when a wagon came up the main street at speed, which was unusual, because wagons did not generally come up main streets at speed unless something had gone wrong. This one was pulled by 2 horses that were clearly not comfortable with the pace being asked of them, and it was driven by a man who looked equally uncomfortable, a heavy-set fellow in a brown coat with his hat askew, and his face expressing the concentrated panic of someone managing a crisis with insufficient skill. The wagon lurched, hit a rut, and the left rear wheel dropped hard into the depression, snapping the axle with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon tilted sharply, cargo shifted, and several crates slid off the back and hit the street. The horses, released from the wrong-footed weight, slowed and stopped, blowing hard. Benjamin was already moving before the dust settled. He went to the horses first, took both bridles, spoke low and steady until the animals calmed. Then he looked at the driver who had climbed down and was staring at the broken axle with the expression of a man receiving news he already knew was coming but had hoped to avoid. "You all right?" Benjamin asked. "Axle's gone," the man said, which answered nothing about his personal well-being but was clearly what concerned him most. "I can see that. Are you hurt?" The man looked up as if the question surprised him. No, I am fine, but I have to be in San Antonio by tomorrow evening and I am still 2 days out and now I have no wagon." "What is in the crates?" "Dry goods, fabric mostly. I supply 3 shops in San Antonio." He looked at the fallen crates with the specific anguish of a man watching his livelihood sitting in the dirt. Benjamin helped him collect the spilled crates. None of them had broken open. He helped the man negotiate with the livery at the end of the street for a replacement wagon, which took the better part of 2 hours and a significant sum of money that made the man wince visibly. And by the time everything was sorted and the cargo loaded into the replacement wagon, the sun was leaning west and the best of the travel day was gone. The man, whose name turned out to be Oscar Finch, insisted on buying Benjamin's supper at the small eating house across from the livery, which Benjamin accepted because it seemed rude not to, and because Oscar Finch, despite his panic, turned out to be pleasant company. They ate salt pork and beans and cornbread at a table near the window, and Oscar talked about his supply route and his family in San Antonio, his wife Margaret and their 3 children, and the shop owners he supplied, 2 of whom were demanding women who inspected every bolt of fabric for flaws with the dedication of territorial judges, and one of whom was a very particular dressmaker named Mrs. Holloway, who ran a shop on Commerce Street and whose standards were so exacting that Oscar had once sent a bolt of calico back to the supplier in Galveston because Mrs. Holloway had declared the dye uneven. Commerce Street, Benjamin said, keeping his voice level. Yes, fine shop. Her assistant has been with her for years, does most of the fine work. Young woman, very capable, Edna something. Oscar took a bite of cornbread and chewed thoughtfully. Talmadge, that is it, quiet girl. Very good with a needle. Benjamin set down his fork. He picked it back up. He finished his supper and said very little else. And when Oscar retired early in preparation for his own early departure, Benjamin walked out into the dark street and stood for a long time looking at the stars, which were extraordinary out here, thick and bright and indifferent to everything happening below them. And he put his hand to his breast pocket and felt the small shape of the portrait through the cloth. He had known she was in San Antonio. He had known the name of the dressmaker's shop from Gerald Talmadge's old letters, which he had obtained from Horace Deal when he passed through 3 months ago to discuss the land agency position. He had known all of this. But hearing her name said aloud by a stranger in a dust-blown eating house in Harlan's Creek made everything suddenly very real in a way it had not been before, made it something he would have to face rather than something he could carry at a safe distance in his breast pocket. He was not afraid of much. He had ridden into situations that would have sent sensible men in the other direction without his pulse changing notably. But this was different. This was the particular terror of the things that matter, which is a fear that has nothing in common with ordinary fear, except that it lives in the same chest. He went to bed in the boarding house and lay awake for a long time listening to the wind, and then fell asleep and dreamed of nothing, which was a mercy. He left at first light, before Oscar Finch was stirring, and rode south through the hill country in the long early quiet, the light coming up gold through the cedar and live oak, the air still cool with the memory of night, his horse's hooves finding the rocky trail with the casual confidence of an animal that had traveled difficult ground before and knew how to read it. The Frio River crossing was where the woman at the dry goods store had said it would be, and the detour east added not 4 miles but something closer to 6, which cost him the better part of the afternoon, but the water level had dropped enough that the crossing was not dangerous, only wet and cold for a few minutes, and he came out the other side dripping and moved on without stopping. He camped that night in a shallow draw with cedar on 3 sides cutting the wind, built a small fire, boiled his coffee, ate his dried meat and hardtack, and spent a long time with the portrait in his hand, tilted toward the firelight, looking at the painted face of Edna Talmadge. He had composed in his head probably 40 versions of what he would say when he met her. None of them sounded right. They all sounded like things a man said when he was trying to sound like a man who knew what he was doing, which was not the same as actually knowing. He could tell her about Gerald, about the night by the fire, about how her uncle had handed him this small piece of her, and how it had traveled with him through 3 years of cattle drives and cold winters and dusty town after dusty town, always in his left breast pocket, always close. But that sounded, when he tried it in the quiet of his own mind, like the kind of thing that might alarm a woman rather than move her. He was a stranger to her. He was a man who had carried her likeness for 3 years without her knowledge, which was, he supposed, either profoundly romantic or deeply strange depending on how it was received. He put the portrait back in his pocket. He put out the fire. He lay on his bedroll and watched the stars wheel above the cedar tops and thought about Gerald Talmadge, who had died with a fever, and who had pressed this portrait into his hand with a smile that Benjamin had not known, at the time, was the smile of a man doing something deliberate. He arrived in San Antonio in the late afternoon of the second day, coming in from the north through the limestone hills, the city spreading before him in the early spring light, larger than he had expected, the San Antonio River winding through it, the old missions rising to the south, the streets busy with wagons and horses and the sound of people, which after 2 days of open country was both welcome and startling. He found a livery on St. Mary's Street and stabled his horse, a big roan gelding named Cooper who had carried him without complaint through most of the past year, and then found a boarding house 2 blocks away that was clean and reasonably priced and run by a stout woman named Mrs. Alcazar, who showed him his room with professional efficiency and informed him that supper was at 6 and that she tolerated no boots on the beds. He washed the trail off himself as best he could with the basin and pitcher on the washstand, changed his shirt, and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time with the portrait in his hand. Commerce Street, Oscar had said. Mrs. Holloway's dress shop. It would be sensible to go tomorrow. It would be sensible to present himself at the land agency first, establish himself, get some footing in the city before walking into a dress shop on Commerce Street looking for a woman he had never met. He put the portrait in his pocket and went out into the late afternoon. Commerce Street was alive with the particular energy of a prosperous city street in 1882. Wagons and buggies moving in both directions, men in suits and women in good dresses navigating the wooden boardwalks, a pair of vaqueros moving through on horseback with the easy posture of men entirely comfortable in the saddle, the smell of a bakery mixing with the smell of horses and leather, and the faint mineral tang of the river a few blocks east. He found Mrs. Holloway's dress shop between a hardware merchant and a saddle maker. The sign above the door was painted in careful letters, M. Holloway, dressmaker, established 1874. The window displayed 2 dress forms wearing gowns of pale green and ivory, and the fabrics were fine enough that Benjamin, who knew very little about fabric, could tell they were fine even from outside. He stood on the boardwalk across the street for a while, which he knew looked suspicious, and he tried to look like a man who was simply resting rather than a man conducting a reconnaissance. The shop door opened once and a woman in a blue dress came out carrying a wrapped package, and for one moment his heart did something sudden and unprepared, but the woman was perhaps 50 and silver-haired and not who he was looking for. He crossed the street. He stood in front of the shop door. He read the sign again as if he had not already read it from across the street. He pushed the door open. The interior smelled of fabric and cedar, and the faint sweetness of pressed flowers, which he later learned came from sachets Mrs. Holloway placed among the bolts of cloth to keep the moths away. The shop was elegantly organized, bolts of fabric along the walls, a long cutting table in the center, a smaller table near the window where the light was good, and at that smaller table, bent over a piece of pale blue silk with a needle in her hand and total concentration on her face, was a woman with dark hair pinned above a long, graceful neck. Benjamin stopped walking. She had not heard him come in, or if she had, she was finishing a stitch before she looked up, which was the kind of discipline that spoke to both professionalism and character. When she did look up, it was with the unhurried manner of a person who is interrupted often and has learned to complete the thought before responding. She looked at him. He looked at her. She was nothing like the portrait and entirely like the portrait. The portrait had captured the essential quality of her face, the long, elegant line of it, the brown eyes with their amber depth, the particular set of her mouth that suggested she was in the habit of thinking carefully before speaking. But it had not captured the way she was present, the way she occupied space with a kind of quiet authority that was not aggressive but simply very real, the way her hands were still holding the silk even as her eyes were fully on him. The portrait had been a beautiful approximation. The woman across this small shop was a different order of thing altogether. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was low and clear, a San Antonio voice with a slight Texas gentleness in it, the voice of someone who had grown up speaking carefully because the things they said mattered to them. He realized he had been standing without speaking for a moment too long. He cleared his throat. "I am looking for Miss Talmadge," he said. "Miss Edna Talmadge." Something shifted in her expression, not alarm but attention, a focusing. "I am Edna Talmadge," she said. He put his hand to his breast pocket. He stopped himself. He said, "My name is Benjamin Reed. I knew your Uncle Gerald." The shift in her expression now was different and more complex. Something moved through her face like whether a quick succession of things, recognition of the name, a shadow of grief, something softer underneath it. She set the silk down carefully on the table, laid the needle across it, and stood. "Gerald wrote about you," she said. "He mentioned you in several of his letters." That surprised him. He had not known that. "Good things, I hope." "He said you were the most quietly competent man he had met in a decade of traveling, which from my uncle was the highest possible praise." She looked at him steadily. "He died in October of 1880. I was very sorry to lose him." "So was I," Benjamin said. "I am very sorry for your loss as well." There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of pause that exists between two people who are both saying true things and giving those true things the respect of a moment's silence. "You have come a long way from Abilene," she said. "I have. I accepted a position at Deal and Associates. Land agency work." She nodded. "Horace Deal. He was my uncle's partner. He is a good man." "He has been very kind," Benjamin agreed. From the back of the shop came the sound of movement, and then a door opened and a woman appeared who was clearly Mrs. Holloway, a compact, decisive-looking woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and the manner of someone who ran things well and knew it. She looked at Benjamin with the particular assessment of someone accustomed to judging the quality of things. "A customer," she said to Edna. "A visitor," Edna said. "This is Benjamin Reed, Aunt Martha. He knew my Uncle Gerald." Mrs. Holloway's expression shifted from professional to warmly curious. "Gerald Talmadge's friend. Come in, then." "Edna, make some tea if you would." "Mr. Reed, sit down. Any friend of Gerald's is welcome here." He sat. Tea appeared. Mrs. Holloway, who turned out to be Edna's mother's sister, not Gerald's wife as Benjamin had initially assumed, asked him questions about Gerald with the directness of a woman who was grieving still and wanted more material to grieve with, wanted more pieces of the person she had lost. Benjamin told her what he could about the 2 weeks in Abilene, about Gerald's good humor and his pride in Edna, about the campfire evenings and the particular way Gerald had of telling a story that made everything in it vivid. Edna sat across from him and listened, and her face as she listened was the most expressive thing in the room. Every story about her uncle moved across her features like light across water, rippling with recognition and affection, and the specific sadness of loving someone who is no longer in the world. He did not take out the portrait that day. It was not the right moment. He drank his tea and told his stories about Gerald and left when the afternoon light was going and the shop needed to close. And as he stood at the door to say goodbye, Edna Talmadge looked at him with those brown amber eyes and said, "You should come to Sunday dinner. My mother will want to hear everything you have told us today." "I would be honored," he said, meaning it more completely than he had ever meant anything. He walked back to his boarding house through the spring evening, through the soft San Antonio dusk with the sound of a guitar coming from somewhere on the river and the smell of food from a dozen open doors. And he felt the weight of the portrait in his pocket and thought that Gerald Talmadge, wherever he was probably very pleased with himself. The days between that Thursday afternoon and Sunday dinner were occupied with the land agency. Horace Deal turned out to be exactly as good a man as Edna had indicated. A stout, fair-skinned man in his 50s with magnificent side whiskers and the careful honesty of someone who had learned, perhaps the hard way, that it was also the most practical policy. He welcomed Benjamin with genuine warmth, showed him the office on Soledad Street, explained the territory, the ranches and parcels and ongoing negotiations, and within 2 days had assigned Benjamin to survey a disputed boundary east of the city, which required riding out and spending a day in the field with a surveyor named Torres, a quiet mestizo man of exceptional competence who knew the land the way some people know their own houses. Benjamin and Tors rode out through the Tuesday morning mist and spent the day measuring and noting and finding the cedar stakes that marked the original survey lines. And when they rode back in the late afternoon, Tors said, mostly to the air in front of him, "You seem like a man who is waiting for something." "Everybody is waiting for something," Benjamin said. "True, but some men carry it more obviously than others." Benjamin glanced at him. Tors was looking straight ahead at the road, his expression pleasantly neutral. "Sunday," Benjamin said. "Ah," Tors said, and asked nothing further, which Benjamin appreciated. Sunday came with the particular quality of San Antonio Sundays, which is to say with church bells from half a dozen directions, and the smell of roasting meat beginning early in the morning, and a general feeling of life being lived at a slightly more generous pace than the rest of the week. Benjamin wore his best shirt, which was not spectacular but was clean and pressed, and his least worn boots, and he arrived at the Talmadge house on Flora Street at noon, carrying a small bunch of wild columbines he had found along the river path, which was the best he could manage in terms of a contribution, and which he hoped would be received in the spirit of effort rather than judged for result. The Talmadge house was a modest limestone building with a porch and a garden that someone tended with real care, flowers along the front, and a kitchen garden visible along the side. Edna answered the door before he had fully knocked, which suggested she had been watching for him, which caused something in his chest to rearrange itself with a small and pleasant violence. She was wearing a dress of deep rose, her dark hair down from the tight professional arrangement he had seen in the shop and styled more loosely, and she looked at the columbines in his hand, and something in her face went soft in a way that was private and real and not performed. "Those are beautiful," she said. "Where did you find columbines?" "Along the river, about half a mile north of the Commerce Street Bridge." "I did not know they grew there," she said, taking them carefully. "Thank you." Her mother was inside, a small woman named Louise Talmadge who had the same quality of precise attention as her daughter and who looked at Benjamin with the direct, measuring gaze of a woman who had been raising a daughter alone since her husband died 8 years ago and was not about to stop being careful. She was not unfriendly. She was thorough. She asked him about his family, which was a father dead and a mother in Missouri and 2 brothers, one in Kansas and one in Colorado, and about his work and his prospects and his faith, which was the kind Benjamin described as imperfect but sincere, which made her smile slightly. Edna cooked. Benjamin discovered this when he offered to help and was pointed to the kitchen, and found Edna at the stove with an apron over her rose dress, turning cornbread in a cast-iron skillet with the complete competence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He stood near the doorway, not wanting to get in her way, and they talked while she cooked, a different kind of talking than they had done in the dress shop, more personal, more searching, the kind of conversation where both people are listening very carefully not just to the words but to what lives behind them. She asked him about the cattle drives, what they were actually like, not the versions people told in dime novels but the actual days, the actual ground, and he told her honestly, the boredom and the cold and the moments of genuine beauty, the way the Kishom Trail looked in the early morning light, the sound of 10,000 cattle moving in the dark. She listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed she was actually thinking about what he was saying rather than simply waiting for her turn to speak. He asked her about the dress shop, about what she actually enjoyed about the work, and she was quiet for a moment before she said that it was the problem-solving, that every garment was a puzzle of fabric and structure, and the particular person wearing it, that the best garments were the ones that made the person inside them feel most like themselves, and that she found enormous satisfaction in figuring out how to do that. "Gerald said you read everything you could find," Benjamin said. She turned from the stove and looked at him. "He said that to you. By the fire in Abilene, he talked about you for 2 weeks. Her expression went through something complex and private, love for the dead uncle, gratitude for the information, and something else, something that was perhaps the beginning of understanding what she had been to him. "He sent me books," she said. "From everywhere he traveled. He had terrible taste in some of them and wonderful taste in others, and I read them all." What was the best one? She thought about it seriously. A copy of Jane Eyre. He found it in a bookshop in St. Louis. The binding was coming apart and he had it repaired before he sent it. She turned back to the stove. "I still have it." What was the worst? She laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded, and it changed her face into something so warm and immediate that Benjamin had to look away for a moment. "A history of agricultural practices in the Ohio River Valley," she said. "I believe he thought the subject would improve my practical knowledge. I read every word of it, which I deeply regret." Dinner was long and good, the food simple and well-made, and Louise Talmadge thawed by degrees over the course of it, asking fewer probing questions and contributing more of her own stories. Of Gerald as a young man, of the Talmadge family in Virginia before the war, of coming west after the war with her husband when Virginia felt like a closed chapter and Texas felt like something that might still be written. She was a woman with a story in her, several of them, and Benjamin listened to all of it because it was interesting, and because it was Edna's history, which made it valuable to him in the way that anything connected to her was becoming valuable. After dinner, Edna walked him to the door. Her mother had retreated to the parlor, either out of delicacy or genuine fatigue, and they stood on the porch in the early evening, the garden in front of them releasing the warm smell of turned earth and new growth. "I am glad you came," Edna said. "So am I," he said. Then, because the moment was right and he did not know if another right moment would present itself cleanly, he reached into his breast pocket and took out the portrait. He held it out to her. She looked at it for a moment before she took it, and when she did, he watched her recognize it, watched the small, careful shock of seeing herself rendered in paint on ivory, and then the deeper recognition, the processing of what it meant that a man who had known her uncle for 2 weeks had been carrying her portrait for 3 years. She looked up at him. "Gerald gave you this." "The night before he left Abilene. I tried to send it back afterward, but I did not have a reliable address for him, and then I heard he had died." He paused. "I have carried it since the day he gave it to me." She was quiet for a long time, looking at the portrait and then at him, and he waited because there was nothing he could add that would make any of it clearer or easier to receive. "3 years," she said. "Yes. You never tried to write to me directly." "I did not have the right to write to you directly," he said. "A man cannot write to a woman he has never met on the basis of a portrait her uncle gave him. It would have been inappropriate. But you kept it." "Yes." She turned the portrait over in her fingers, looking at the back of it, which was plain ivory with a small painted flower in the corner that Gerald had probably added himself, his particular mark on the things he loved. "He had good taste," she said quietly, "in some things at least, agricultural history notwithstanding." She looked up and there was the laugh again, softer this time, and her eyes were bright. She held the portrait back out to him and he looked at it and then at her. "Keep it," she said. He looked at her. "You have had it for 3 years," she said. "It is practically yours by now." There was something in her voice that was careful and warm and a little daring all at once, the voice of someone choosing to be brave about something they want. He put the portrait back in his pocket. "Will you come to the shop this week?" she asked. "Not for professional reasons, just to talk. The afternoons are slow on Wednesdays." "I will come Wednesday afternoon," he said. "Good," she said, and smiled, and went inside, and Benjamin Reed stood on the porch of the Talmadge house on Flora Street for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, breathing the smell of the garden and the evening, and what felt very much like the beginning of something he had been walking toward for 3 years. Wednesday afternoon came, and then Thursday morning he found a reason to pass by Commerce Street on the way to a meeting. And on Friday, Edna appeared at the land agency office with a parcel that turned out to contain a piece of cake wrapped in cloth, which she handed to Mrs. Alcazar at the front desk, and which found its way to Benjamin's desk with a small note that said only, "I made too much of this." He ate the cake at his desk and read the note several times, and then folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket alongside the portrait, where it stayed. May arrived. The city bloomed into its most beautiful season, the acequia walking paths along the river bright with wildflowers, the evenings warm enough to sit outside and talk. Benjamin and Edna developed a rhythm, Wednesday afternoons in the shop when Mrs. Holloway was visiting her sister and the shop was their own, Sunday dinners with Louise, and whenever else either of them could find a plausible excuse, which became more frequently as the weeks went on, and the excuses became thinner and less necessary. They talked about everything. That was what Benjamin found most extraordinary about her, that there was no corner of her mind she kept deliberately dark, no subject she protected from examination. She talked about her father's death, which had happened when she was 14, the particular grief of it and the way it had changed her mother, made Louise both harder and more tender in the way that loss sometimes does. She talked about the work she had done since she was 16 to help support the household, first as a seamstress's helper, and then as a full apprentice under Mrs. Holloway, who had trained her with the rigor of someone who believed in both her craft and her protégé. She talked about the books she had read, and the ones she wished she could read, and the ones she thought were overrated, and she had opinions about all of it, real specific opinions backed by reasons. Benjamin talked in return, more than he had talked to most people in the previous decade combined. He told her about his childhood in Missouri, a farming family, 3 boys and enough work to fill every hour, and the moment at 17 when he had understood that farming was not what was in him and had said so to his father, who had been angry and then practical, which was his father's particular sequence for most things. He told her about following the cattle north the first time, the scale of it, the vastness of the plains that had hit him like something physical after a lifetime of Missouri woods and hills. He told her about the deputy work, the parts that were interesting and the parts that were simply procedurally dull, and about why he had decided, finally, to come south. He had not told her about the portrait as the reason. She knew he had it. She knew Gerald had given it to him. But he had not said directly that it was part of why he had come to San Antonio, because that truth was large and slightly unruly, and he was not sure how to say it without sounding like a man in a dime novel rather than a man trying to tell something real. It was Edna who said it, on an afternoon in late May when the windows of the shop were open, and the street noise mixed with the particular warm quiet of a room full of fabric and careful work. She was hemming a skirt and he was sitting across the cutting table from her, and she said, without looking up from her work, "The portrait was why you came, wasn't it? Not just Gerald's memory, not just the job." He was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he said, "more than partly." He considered denying it and decided against it because she was too perceptive and he respected her too much. "Yes," he said, "more than partly." She looked up. Her needle was still in the fabric. "I want to be honest with you about something," she said. "All right. When you first came into the shop, I recognized your name immediately. Gerald mentioned you in at least 5 letters. Described you as someone worth knowing. He wrote in one of the last letters before he died that he had a feeling about you." She paused. "I had already been curious about you for 2 years before you walked through my door." Something in him went very still. "He wrote about me to you. Extensively," she said. "He was not subtle, my uncle. He was very good at many things, and subtlety was not among them." There was grief in her voice and affection, the two things wound together so tightly they were inseparable. "He told me he had given you my portrait. He told me in the letter before he died. He said he hoped it would give you a reason to come south eventually." Benjamin sat with this for a long moment. Gerald Talmadge by the fire in Abilene in the autumn of 1879, handing over the portrait with a casual smile and a probably very deliberate agenda. "He arranged this," Benjamin said. "He arranged the conditions for it," Edna said carefully. "Whether it actually became anything was always going to be up to us." "Is it becoming something?" he asked. He had not intended to ask it so directly, but it was out before he had managed it. She did not look away. "Yes," she said, "I believe it is." She went back to her hemming, and he sat across from her, and neither of them said anything else for a while. But the quality of the silence had changed, had become something warmer and more inhabited. The silence of two people who have acknowledged the truth of something, and are now simply living in that truth without needing to keep proving it. June brought heat and the smell of the river, and a contract dispute between two ranches east of the city that required Benjamin to ride out for several days, first with tours and then alone, mapping and measuring and interviewing the ranchers, who were both certain they were right and both approximately half right in ways that required careful navigation. He came back from the third trip to find a note from Edna on his desk at the land agency, which had apparently been delivered with such calm authority that his colleague, a young man named Phillips, had felt compelled to place it directly on his desk rather than the general correspondence pile. The note said that she had been to the lending library and found a book she thought he would appreciate, and would he like to come to Sunday dinner and pick it up, adding, almost as an afterthought, that her mother had specifically asked her to invite him, which they both knew was not quite accurate in terms of whose idea it was, though Louise Talmadge had certainly stopped objecting. He wrote back yes and came to Sunday dinner, and the book was a collection of survey and exploration accounts from the 1840s and 1850s, Western territories, and it was excellent. And after dinner Louise went to bed early and Benjamin and Edna sat on the porch in the warm June dark and talked until very late, until the stars had moved significantly, and the street had gone quiet, and the only sound was the distant river and the occasional dog. "I need to tell you something," he said, at some point in that late quiet. "Tell me," she said. "I have thought about you for 3 years, not in a troubling way, I hope, but with a kind of consistent regard that I have not directed at very much else. I do not entirely understand it because I did not know you. I knew a painted image of you and the things your uncle said, but there was something in that combination that seemed to indicate the particular kind of person you are, and I found that I thought about that person regularly and sometimes wondered if the actual person matched what I imagined." She was quiet for a moment. "And does she?" "No," he said. She looked at him. "She is considerably better than what I imagined," he said. "What I imagined was a good person. What you are is an exceptional one, and I was not entirely prepared for the difference." In the warm dark of the porch with the river somewhere below the night and the stars thick above the city, Edna Talmadge leaned across the space between their chairs and kissed him once on the corner of his mouth, with the deliberate gentleness of a person who knows what they are doing and has decided to do it. He turned and they looked at each other very close, and then she kissed him properly, and he kissed her back, and the night went on around them and was very quiet and very warm and entirely theirs. He walked home afterward through streets that felt rearranged, the familiar route from Flora Street to the boarding house transformed by the simple and absolute fact of what had just happened, and he stopped once under a gas lamp and took the portrait from his pocket and looked at it, and then put it back and walked on, feeling something in him that had been held at a careful distance for 3 years finally allowed to settle into its proper place. July was magnificent in its own way, which is to say it was extremely hot, and they found their way through the heat to the cooler hours, morning walks along the river before the sun climbed, evenings on the porch with glasses of cold water and the sustained pleasure of each other's company. Benjamin had settled thoroughly into the land agency work, which suited him in ways he had not fully anticipated. The combination of outdoor field work and careful office work, the satisfaction of disputes resolved and boundaries established, the gradual accumulation of knowledge about the land around San Antonio that was making him genuinely useful. He was also, in the slow way of a person who has spent a long time in motion, finally finding a place to be still, becoming part of the city. He knew the people at the livery by name, and they knew him. He had attended Mrs. Alcazar's boarding house table long enough to understand the social geography of its residents. He had been to church with Edna and her mother 3 Sundays running, and the congregation, which was cautious about newcomers in the way of small communities everywhere, was beginning to recognize him and nod. There was a difficulty in the middle of July, the kind that arrives without warning and changes the temperature of everything. It came in the form of a man named Douglas Farwell, who appeared one Tuesday morning at the land agency, and turned out to be a lawyer from Houston, with papers relating to a tract of land in which Horace Deal had an interest, and the legal situation of which was not entirely straightforward. Benjamin spent 3 days reviewing documents and riding out to the disputed property, and meeting with Torres and another surveyor, and finally presenting his findings to Deal, who listened, and then said that the situation was going to require a formal mediation and possibly a judge. This was not unusual in land work in Texas in 1882. The state was full of disputed claims and competing interests and legal frameworks that had been established under 4 different governments over the previous half-century, each of which had approached land title differently. Benjamin had known this coming in. But this particular case had a specific complication, which was that one of the claimants was the Romero family, who had held the land since before Texas was Texas, who had clear documentation of their original Spanish land grant, and whose claim was being challenged by a relatively recent purchaser who had bought from a party whose title was now questionable. Torres, when Benjamin consulted him on the ride back from the property, was quiet for a long time before he said, "The Romero family has farmed that land since 1798. Their grandfather's grandfather is buried on it." "I know," Benjamin said, "and Horace Deal's interest. He holds a mortgage on the property the recent purchaser bought. If the purchase is voided, the mortgage is complicated." Torres nodded. "What are you going to tell him?" Benjamin was quiet for a moment. "The truth," he said, "that the Romero claim is solid and the challenge is weak, and that the land agency's integrity is worth more than one complicated mortgage." Torres looked at him sideways. "Deal may not like that." "He may not, but he is a fair man. I believe he will accept it." He told Deal the next morning, laying out his assessment plainly and completely, acknowledging the financial inconvenience but stating clearly that the Romero documentation was valid and the family's claim legitimate, and that pursuing the challenge would be both legally weak and morally indefensible. Deal listened without interrupting, which was itself a quality Benjamin had come to value in him, and then sat quiet for a long moment after, and then said that he appreciated the directness, and that they would withdraw from the mediation, and that the mortgage would have to be handled through other means. Benjamin walked out of that meeting feeling the particular satisfaction of having done the difficult right thing, which is different from the satisfaction of having done the easy right thing, and that evening he told Edna about it over supper at a small restaurant on the river, which had become their established Thursday evening arrangement. She listened to the whole account, and when he finished she said, "Horace Deal took it well. Better than I expected, to be honest. That is because he is a good man who has occasionally made self-interested decisions and feels a certain relief when someone gives him a clear reason not to." She took a sip of her water. "My uncle trusted him completely, and my uncle was not easily trusted." "Your uncle had excellent judgment," Benjamin said, "except about agricultural history." "Except about that." She looked at him across the small restaurant table with the particular look she had, the direct, steady look that managed to be warm and examining at the same time, and said, "I am glad you are here, Benjamin." He held her gaze. "I am glad I came." The end of July brought a dance at the Menger Hotel, a civic occasion organized by the Bixar County Business Association, and Benjamin escorted Edna in a circumstance that felt formally significant in a way that was not discussed explicitly, but was understood by everyone who saw them. Louise Talmadge came as well, with a friend, and she watched her daughter dance with Benjamin Reed with the expression of a woman who has worried carefully, and is now, with appropriate caution, beginning to stop worrying. They danced 4 times, which was the number that announced something in 1882 without requiring anyone to say it, And between dances, they stood at the edge of the floor and watched the other couples and talked in the easy way of people who have gotten past the careful stage and arrived somewhere more comfortable, though not less attentive, because Benjamin was always very attentive with Edna, always listening, always interested in the specific things she said rather than the general fact of her talking. It was the night of the Menger Hotel dance, walking home through the warm San Antonio dark with the music fading behind them and Louise walking discreetly ahead with her friend, that Benjamin said what he had been constructing for several weeks. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want to ask it properly." Edna looked at him. The gas lamps on the street lit one side of her face and left the other in warm shadow, and she was very still. "I came to San Antonio carrying a portrait of a woman I had never met," he said. "That could have been a foolish errand on 100 different accounts. The actual woman could have been nothing like what I had hoped. She could have been married. She could have found me completely without interest. It could have been, in other words, a significant embarrassment that I was very well aware of before I crossed the Frio River. And," she said, "and instead I found someone who is the most interesting person I have encountered in 30 years of life, and someone whose company I want every day, and someone I would like to spend the rest of my life finding more of, because I do not believe I will ever reach the end of what is interesting about her." He stopped walking. "Edna, will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment that felt wide and full and very present, the city alive around them in the dark, and then she said, "Yes, I will marry you." He took her hands. They were standing on the boardwalk on the street 3 blocks from her house, and above them the Texas stars were doing what they always did in a clear summer sky, which was to be extraordinary, and below them the city was doing what it did in 1882, which was to be alive and imperfect and full of people making their way through it. And Benjamin Reed and Edna Talmadge stood in the middle of all of it and looked at each other and were completely still. He kissed her on the street, which was forward, and she kissed him back, which was an answer to that. Louise Talmadge was informed the following morning at breakfast. She sat with her coffee cup in both hands and looked at Benjamin across the table for a moment that he later described to Torres as the most thoroughly examined he had ever felt in his life. And then she said, "Gerald would have been very pleased." And that was all. And then she put down her coffee and embraced her daughter. And the morning went on around them warm and ordinary and entirely changed. They were married in October of 1882 at the church on Commerce Street, where Edna had attended since she was a girl, in a ceremony that was not large but was full of people who cared about Edna and a smaller but growing number who had come to know and respect Benjamin. Torres was there, in a good suit, with his wife and 2 children, and Horace Deal attended and shook Benjamin's hand with considerable feeling, and Mrs. Holloway sat in the front pew beside Louise and wept in a practical way, producing and retiring a handkerchief with efficient regularity. Edna wore a dress she had made herself, ivory silk with a high collar and sleeves that gathered at the shoulder, which was the most technically accomplished piece she had ever sewn, and which she had worked on quietly in the evenings for 2 months, and which was so beautiful that, when she walked down the aisle on the arm of her Uncle Horace, who was Gerald's surviving brother and had come from Virginia for the occasion, Benjamin forgot, briefly, to breathe. He had put the portrait in his left breast pocket that morning, as he had every morning for 3 years, and he kept it there through the ceremony and through the reception afterward at the Talmadge house, where tables had been set up in the garden and food was provided by what seemed like the entire neighborhood, and music was played by a trio of vaquero musicians Mrs. Alcazar had arranged, who played beautifully through the afternoon. At some point in the late afternoon, when the light was going gold and the party was well established, Edna found him standing near the garden wall with a glass of cider, looking out at their assembled people, and she came and stood beside him and took his hand. "You have something in your pocket," she said. He reached into his breast pocket and took out the portrait and held it in his palm between them. She looked at it. "You wore it today." "I have worn it every day for 3 years," he said. It seemed appropriate to carry it for one more day. She looked at the small painted oval for a long time, at the image of her younger self rendered in careful brushstrokes by a painter in San Antonio who had done the portrait as a gift for Gerald and who was probably not aware of the subsequent career his work had enjoyed. "What will you do with it now?" she said. He thought about it. "I thought perhaps we should put it somewhere safe, in the house, on a shelf somewhere, where it does not have to travel anymore." She took it gently from his palm and looked at it a moment longer. "Gerald had good taste," she said, "in at least one very important thing." "Several things," Benjamin said. She looked up at him. "Several things," she agreed. He leaned down and kissed his wife in the garden in the October afternoon. With the music playing and the people talking around them and the smell of flowers and food, and the particular sweetness of a day when everything is exactly right. And she kissed him back warmly and thoroughly, and without any hurry at all, because they had all the time there was now, and they both knew it. They set up their household together in a house on King William Street, a limestone house with 2 bedrooms, and a kitchen with a good stove, and a small front garden that Edna immediately began planning for spring planting, and a back porch that faced east and caught the morning light. Mrs. Holloway's shop stayed on Commerce Street, and Edna continued to work there, which suited everyone, because she was not a woman who wanted to stop working, and Benjamin, who understood this completely, would have been surprised if she had wanted to. The house filled up with her books almost immediately. She had more books than the house's available shelves could accommodate, and Benjamin built 2 additional shelves in the first week, and these were full within a month. And the subject of additional shelving became a regular domestic negotiation conducted with mutual amusement. He learned things about her that you can only learn about a person by living with them. She was a very early riser, already dressed and in the kitchen before 6, which was fine because he had been rising at 5 for his entire adult life. She was extremely decisive about practical things and considerably more uncertain about personal ones, which she was aware of and found mildly irritating in herself. She sang while she cooked, not loudly, just under her breath, usually hymns but occasionally something she had heard on the street that had lodged itself in her memory against her preference. She read at night until very late if he did not appear in the bedroom doorway and give her the look that meant she had been reading for 3 hours, and it was past midnight. She learned things about him. He was a man who fixed things the moment they needed fixing, which meant the house was in excellent repair, but also meant he could be found on a Saturday morning replacing a door hinge when she had expected him to still be at breakfast. He had more patience than any person she had known, but a very clear point past which the patience stopped, and at that point he became very quiet in a way that was more effective than shouting, because it required active attention to read. He was profoundly uncomfortable with being thanked for things, a product, she suspected, of a childhood where effort was expected and acknowledgement was not standard, and she made it a practice to thank him specifically and directly for things, and to observe the way it still surprised him every time. Winter came and King William Street was cold in the way Texas winters are cold, which is intermittently and dramatically rather than consistently. Long stretches of mild days interrupted by blue northers that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in an afternoon, and sent everyone indoors for fireside evenings that Benjamin found himself enjoying with a completeness that surprised him, having spent so many years where the indoor evening was a stopping of motion rather than a thing in itself. He read. He had not been much of a reader before Edna, in the sense that he had not particularly pursued it, but she had introduced him to her library in the way of someone offering a new geography, with enthusiasm and good judgment about where to start, and he found that he was in fact a reader who simply had not had the right conditions before. She started him on the exploration accounts, which she knew he would appreciate, and then moved him sideways into natural history, and he was reading a geological survey of the Texas Hill Country one February evening, with the thoroughness of someone who finds the material genuinely interesting. They had a disagreement in January that was their first real one, not the easy, comfortable friction of two people learning each other's habits, but a genuine conflict of perspective on something that mattered. It was about Louise, Edna's mother, who was ill that winter with a persistent chest cold that was taking longer than usual to resolve. Edna wanted her mother to come and live with them. Benjamin's position was that the King William house was small for 3 adults, and that Louise was a private woman who might prefer her own space with more support from them, rather than giving up her household. The disagreement lasted 3 days. It was conducted with the restraint of two people who respected each other and knew that the way you fight is as important as the position you are fighting for, but it was genuinely felt by both of them. Edna because her mother was her responsibility and her love, and the thought of Louise ill and alone was not something she could set aside. Benjamin because he was trying to balance two truths that were both real, that Edna's instinct to care for her mother was right and good, and that there were practical considerations that would affect all 3 of them. It was resolved in the end by Louise herself, who came to Sunday dinner and listened to both of them with the calm authority of a woman who has outlasted a great many conflicts she did not start, and then said that she had spoken to Mrs. Fernandez next door, who was a widow of similar age and similar circumstance, and that the 2 of them had discussed the possibility of sharing Louise's house, which would provide company and shared domestic work and considerably less loneliness than either of them was currently experiencing. Benjamin and Edna looked at each other across the dinner table. "You solved your own problem," Edna said to her mother. "I generally do," Louise said pleasantly. Benjamin very nearly laughed and contained it. Edna looked at him, and he could see she was doing the same thing. The disagreement dissolved, replaced by the particular warmth of two people who have been through something difficult together and come out the other side intact. Spring returned to San Antonio in the way it always did, somewhat startling in its abundance, and the garden on King William Street came into its own with what Edna had planned in the fall. Columbines along the fence because Benjamin had found her the first ones along the river, and she had transplanted them. Bluebonnets in the front strip between the wall and the street, kitchen herbs along the south side of the house where the sun was best. She told him in April that she was expecting a child, in the kitchen in the early morning before either of them had said much of anything, and his response was to put down his coffee cup and take her face in both his hands and look at her for a long moment with an expression that she later described to Mrs. Holloway as the most completely undone she had ever seen him. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of man he was. "I am very well," she said. He kissed her forehead and her hair and then simply held her for a while in the kitchen in the early morning light, and she let him, and the house was very quiet around them. The child was born in November of 1883, a boy, which surprised Edna for reasons she could not entirely articulate and delighted Benjamin for reasons that were uncomplicated and evident. They named him Gerald after her uncle, which was the decision of about 30 seconds, and was made so naturally that neither of them mentioned that they had made a decision at all. The name simply arrived in the room the way the right answer to a question sometimes does, and was accepted. Gerald Reed was a healthy and energetic child who screamed his way into the world, and then settled into a more moderate and thoughtful approach to existence, which Edna said suggested he had gotten the best of both of them. He had Benjamin's dark hair, and when they began to emerge, his mother's amber eyes, and he was the subject of intense interest from Louise Talmadge, who visited 3 times a week with the regularity and thoroughness of someone who had been planning for a grandchild for some time and had no intention of experiencing it at a distance. Mrs. Holloway crocheted a blanket in white and yellow and brought it to the house with the manner of a woman who is not particularly given to sentiment, but has made an exception. Torres brought a carved wooden toy from a craftsman in La Valida, a small horse on wheels that Gerald would not be capable of using for another year, but which occupied a place of honor on the shelf above his cradle in the meantime. Benjamin sat with his son in the evenings in the rocking chair Edna's Uncle Horace had shipped from Virginia as a wedding gift, which they had stored in the second bedroom for a year, before understanding its intended purpose, and rocked and talked to the baby in the low, easy voice of a man who is comfortable with quiet, and has discovered that you can say things to a small, sleeping person that you might not say to anyone else. Things about the plains and the stars and the river and the woman sleeping in the next room who is the best thing you have ever done, the smartest and bravest and most real thing, and how the boy is going to understand that eventually, but right now it is enough that he is here and healthy and beginning. The land agency continued to grow. By 1884, Horace Deal had made Benjamin a full partner, which was a recognition of work done and trust established and also of simple practical reality, because Benjamin had become the person most clients asked for and most disputes most productively assigned to. He and Torres spent long days out in the hill country and the rolling country east of the city, and the work had a satisfaction to it that Benjamin had not experienced in previous jobs, the satisfaction of something built steadily over time into something reliable, which suited him. He continued to carry the portrait in his left breast pocket. Not because he needed it anymore, or because the woman was somewhere he was not, but because 3 years of habit is not lightly discarded, and because there was something in the act of carrying it that he had come to understand was not about her face, which he no longer needed to study because he saw it every morning, but about the particular feeling of the ivory oval under his fingers, which had become a kind of touchstone. A thing that meant continuity and constancy, and the story of how he had come to be where he was. Edna found out about this. She was not previously aware that he still carried it, assuming he had transferred it to the shelf or the small box in the bedroom where he kept a few personal items, and she discovered it one morning when she was pressing his coat and found the oval outline in the breast pocket and reached in and took it out. She came to the kitchen where he was having his coffee and set it on the table in front of him without saying anything. He looked at it and then at her. "You still carry it," she said. "Every day." She sat down across from him. Why? He thought about how to say it and then said it directly, because that was the only way worth saying anything to her. "Because it is how I found you. I do not want to put it away the way you put away the thing that brought you somewhere. I want to keep having the experience of being grateful for it." She looked at him across the breakfast table in the morning light, in their kitchen in their house with their son sleeping in the next room, and her face did the thing it did when something had moved her, the slight change in her expression that was subtle and very complete at the same time. The look that he had come to understand was the highest form of her attention, the one she gave to things that mattered most. She reached across the table and took the portrait and looked at it for a moment, turning it in her fingers with the familiar attention she gave to all small, careful things. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron, which he had not noticed her do, and she brought out something and put it on the table beside the portrait. It was a folded piece of paper, worn with folding and unfolding, the edges soft with handling. He looked at it and then at her. "The first letter Gerald wrote me about you," she said. "I have carried it since he died. I did not know at the time if you would ever come, but I kept it." He opened it carefully. Gerald's handwriting, slanted and decisive, covered half the page. He read his own name in another person's description, read the brief sketch Gerald had made of him, the quiet competence, the honesty, the something in his eyes that Gerald said suggested a man who knew what he wanted but had not yet figured out how to want it properly. He put the letter down. 3 years, he said. 3 years, she agreed. They looked at each other across the breakfast table, with the morning coming through the kitchen window and Gerald Jr. beginning to make the preliminary sounds of someone about to wake up and require things. And they were both, in that moment, very clearly and completely present in the life they had made. He picked up the portrait. She reached across and placed the letter beside it in his palm. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket beside the portrait, and from that morning on he carried both. The summer of 1884 was hot and busy and punctuated by a survey trip that kept Benjamin east of the city for 10 days, the longest he had been away from Edna since their marriage. And the reunion at the end of those 10 days had the quality of something discovered anew, the particular pleasure of returning to someone, and finding that the specific texture of their presence, the sound of their voice, the way they moved through familiar rooms, was exactly what you had been missing, and was better than memory had rendered it. He brought Gerald a small carved armadillo from a craftsman in Seguin that the boy was immediately devoted to. He brought Edna a bolt of pale green silk that he had found at a dry goods merchant in Gonzales, carefully wrapped in paper, which she unwrapped with the professional eye of someone evaluating fabric, and then looked up at him with something that was very close to delight. "This is very good silk," she said. "I know absolutely nothing about silk," he said, "but the woman in the shop said that and I believed her." "Make something beautiful with it," he said. "I intended to make something for Mrs. Caldwell's wedding anniversary," she said, and then looked at him with the slight narrowing of her eyes that indicated she was rearranging her intentions. "I will make something for Mrs. Caldwell and something else." The something else turned out to be a dress she made for herself, which she wore to the Christmas celebrations at the church and which was, by general agreement of everyone present, extraordinary. Gerald grew. By the time he was walking, which he accomplished with the aggressive determination of a child who has seen larger people do it, and considers it a reasonable target, the house on King William Street had acquired the particular quality of houses with children in them. The wooden toys in unexpected places, and the small garments on the drying line, and the voice of a small person providing a constant warm commentary on the world that they were encountering fresh and finding very interesting. By the spring of 1885, Edna told him they were expecting again, and this time he was less surprised but no less moved, and the child was born in January of 1886, a girl they named Clara Louise, the second name for her grandmother, who received this information with the composed dignity of someone who was completely undone by it, but was not going to show that at the dinner table. Clara was different from her brother in the way that all children are specifically themselves, quieter in her first years, given to watching things carefully before engaging with them, with her mother's dark hair, and as they emerged, something in her expressions that was so specifically Edna's that Benjamin sometimes caught himself watching his daughter and seeing his wife at a corresponding age, the seriousness, the particular way of tilting her head when something was being considered. The house adapted. The second bedroom became the children's room. Shelves continued to multiply. The garden continued to be tended and expanded and replanted each spring by Edna, who found the outdoor work a good counterweight to the indoor precision of the dress shop. In 1880, 7 tours came to Benjamin with a proposition. There was a parcel of land 12 miles north of the city, 160 acres of hill country land with good water and cedar and limestone outcropping, and a view to the south that Tours described with the restrained precision of a man who does not use superlatives and therefore, when he inclines toward them, means it. The land was available at a reasonable price. Tours was interested in buying it with a partner. He thought Benjamin might want to know about it. Benjamin took Edna to see it on a Sunday in September when the hill country had gone into its fall state, which is one of its finest, the sumac turning red along the creek edges and the light going golden through the live oak. They left the children with Louise for the day and rode out on a borrowed buggy, and the 12 miles through the hills were beautiful enough that they barely talked, just looked. And when they arrived at the parcel and Benjamin helped her down from the buggy, and they walked to the high point on the south side of the land and stood looking at the view Tours had described with his characteristic understatement, Edna was quiet for a long time. "He said the view was notable," Benjamin said. "He was being restrained," she said. "He is always being restrained." She turned slowly, looking at the whole sweep of it, the hills rolling south toward the city, the creek visible in its cedar line, the limestone exposed in a long, pale outcrop to the east that caught the afternoon light. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking I would like to build something here," he said. "Eventually, when the time is right, a proper house." She looked at him. "This is not an impulsive person speaking." "No," he agreed. "I have been thinking about it for several weeks. And Tors would hold the other half. He would farm the east portion. We would have the west and south." She turned back to the view and was quiet for another moment, in the way she was quiet when she was thinking seriously about something, not absent but very present in a focused way. "Yes," she said. Then she turned to him with a smile that was bright and certain and without any reservation in it. "Yes, let us do it." They rode back through the golden afternoon, and the children were both asleep when they arrived at Louise's. Gerald sprawled on the parlor floor with a book he had been looking at more than reading. Clara in Louise's armchair with her grandmother's shawl tucked around her. They gathered the sleeping children without waking them and carried them home through the warm September evening. And that night, after the children were in their beds and the house was quiet, Edna and Benjamin sat on the back porch in the dark and talked about the land and what they might build on it. And when, talking about the future the way people do, when the future seems both distant enough to be planned and close enough to be real. He took the portrait out of his pocket at some point in that evening, the way he sometimes did in quiet moments, not from habit exactly, but from the particular impulse to hold the thing that was the beginning of all of this. He held it in the dark where he could not see it well, turning it in his fingers. "We should put it somewhere in the new house," Edna said. He looked at her in the dark. "When we build it," she said, "the portrait should have a place there, and Gerald's letter." "The founding documents," he said. "Exactly," she said. "Every house should have something like that, something that says how the people inside it found each other." He put the portrait back in his pocket. He took her hand. The night was large and warm around them, the city alive below the hill and the stars alive above it, and the two children sleeping inside the house behind them were the proof of everything, the unmistakable evidence that what had happened between a portrait and a man and the woman the portrait depicted had become something real and full and ongoing. They built the house north of the city over the course of 1889 and 1890. When the children were old enough to spend weekends on the land, and young enough to find it entirely as adventurous as it was. Tor's portion took shape as a working farm, and the two families spent enough Sundays in common that Gerald and Clara grew up knowing the Tor's children as a matter of course, which was simply the kind of thing that happens when two families are joined by shared land and shared work and genuine mutual respect. The house Benjamin built, with the help of a builder named Marin and a considerable amount of his own labor, was limestone naturally, because the limestone was everywhere on the property and was the right material for this place, native to the ground it was built on. It had a long porch facing south toward the view Tors had described with such careful understatement, and a kitchen that Edna had designed with the specificity of someone who had been cooking in other people's kitchens for years and knew exactly what she needed, and rooms enough for the family they were, and the family they might become. They moved in the spring of 1890, on a day when the hill country wildflowers were at their extreme, and the view from the south porch was, as Tors might have said, quite notable. Louise came and Clara Romero from down the road, Mrs. Holloway made the journey in a hired buggy and walked through the house with the expression of someone evaluating workmanship, which she then declared satisfactory, which from Mrs. Holloway was a considerable endorsement. Gerald was 7, and Clara was 4, and they ran through the rooms of the new house and out into the property with the freedom of children given an enormous thing and knowing it. And Benjamin watched them from the south porch while Edna stood beside him with her hand in his. "We need something for the wall," she said. He knew exactly what she meant. He went inside and came back with the portrait in one hand and Gerald's letter in the other, which he had finally removed from his breast pocket after 8 years of carrying both. He had had them framed together the previous month at a framer on Commerce Street, a small double frame of dark wood, the painted oval on the left and the letter, folded open to the page where Benjamin's name appeared, on the right. They hung it together in the front hallway of the limestone house, the first thing you would see coming in the door, the small portrait and the old letter in their shared frame on the white plaster wall. Edna stepped back and looked at it. "Tell me," she said, the way she said things when she wanted to hear the story properly. "There was a man named Gerald Talmadge," Benjamin said, "who sat with me by a fire in Abilene in the autumn of 1879 and talked about his niece for 2 weeks, and then pressed a portrait of her into my hand before he rode away, and I carried that portrait in my coat pocket for 3 years before I was standing in your uncle's friend's description and brave enough to do what I should have done considerably sooner." She looked at him. "3 years," she said. "3 years," he said. She leaned against him on the porch of their limestone house in the hill country in the spring of 1890, his arm around her, the wildflowers going on in every direction they could see, the children's voices audible from somewhere around the east side of the property, and the city of San Antonio visible in the far distance to the south. The place where a woman had been reading her uncle's letters and keeping one of them in her apron pocket, and not quite knowing yet that there was a man who had her portrait in his breast pocket and was working up to the long ride south. "I am glad you came," she said. It was what she had said on the porch of the Flora Street house the first Sunday, the words she had used at the beginning, and she used them now deliberately, a return to the place where things had started. "So am I," he said, as he always had. "Every day." They stood on the porch of the house they had built together on land that was theirs, and the afternoon light went across the hill country in the long, easy way of spring evenings, and everything was exactly as it should be, all the way to the horizon and further than they could see. Edna gave birth to their third child in February of 1892, another boy they named James, who was from his first weeks a child of enormous appetite and decisive opinion, and who fit into the family with the immediacy of someone who belongs completely in the place they have arrived. Gerald was 9 by then, and deeply interested in the working of the land alongside Tor's, following the older man through the east fields with the serious application of a child who has found something real he wants to learn. Clara was 6 and had already demonstrated a capacity for reading that was clearly genetic, and that Louise, who visited regularly by hired buggy from the city where she had remained with Mrs. Fernandez, regarded with transparent pride. The years filled themselves as years do, with the small events that do not feel like events at the time but are understood later to have been the texture of a life. Benjamin worked the land agency until Horace Deal retired in 1894, at which point he and Torres and a younger man named Whitfield reorganized it and continued it, more modestly but more specifically theirs. Edna worked at Mrs. Holloway's shop until Mrs. Holloway died in 1896, peacefully, in her own house on Travis Street, and then she bought the shop from the estate with the help of a loan from Deal, who considered it a sound investment, and ran it herself as Talmadge and Holloway, dressmakers, in honor of the woman who had trained her. The shop on Commerce Street under its new name became what it had always been on its best days, a place of considerable skill and genuine care, where the women of San Antonio came for the important garments of their lives and left feeling like the best version of themselves. Edna hired 2 young women, both in their early 20s, and trained them with the rigor and warmth she had received from Mrs. Holloway, giving them the same combination of high standards and deep respect that she believed was the only honest way to pass on a craft. Gerald grew into a young man with his mother's eyes, and his father's quiet and a specific interest in both the land and in law, which Benjamin thought was probably an influence of the land agency work and the endless legal complexity of Texas property. He went to study in Austin in 1893 at 18, riding away from the limestone house on the best horse his father had, and looking back once at the south porch where both his parents were standing. And the look was the look of a young person leaving and knowing it and choosing it, which is exactly what it should be. Clara was art and books and the specific precision of someone who notices everything, and she grew into a young woman who could have done many things and chose to go to a teacher's college in San Antonio in 1899, studying with the determination of someone who knows what they are good at and intends to pursue it properly. James was the land. He never questioned it, never needed to. By the time he was 12, he was working the property alongside Tor's eldest son, with the uncomplicated engagement of someone who fits their environment completely. And he stayed, which was its own particular happiness, the particular gift of a child who wants exactly what you have to give. In the fall of 1899, when the children were grown or growing, and the limestone house had acquired the specific beauty of a well-loved house that has been lived in for nearly a decade, Edna came to find Benjamin on the south porch on a Sunday afternoon, where he was sitting with the hill country spread before him in the fall light. She sat beside him, which was where she always sat, the chair beside his where the afternoon light was good. She reached into her pocket and brought out the portrait. He looked at it. "I took it down from the hallway," she said. "I want you to carry it again." He looked at her. "Not because I need you to," she said, "because you should. Because it is yours and it has always been yours, and I think you are the kind of man who should carry the things that matter to him close to his heart, and this one has been on the wall long enough." He took it from her. The ivory oval, worn at the edges now with years of handling, the painted face softened by age in exactly the way she had aged in life, so that the portrait was simultaneously younger than her and somehow still true to who she was. He held it for a moment in his palm and then put it in his left breast pocket. He felt it settle against his chest with the complete familiar weight of something that had always belonged there. She took his hand. They sat together on the south porch of their limestone house in the October afternoon, the hill country rolling away to the south under the high blue sky, and the house was full behind them of the life they had built there together. Her books on every shelf and his surveying instruments in the study, and the children's rooms preserved in their absence, and the kitchen where she sang while she cooked, and the hallway where Gerald's letter still hung in its dark frame on the white wall. And ahead of them the land went on under the sky in every direction, as it always had, as it would go on after them, unchanged and indifferent and beautiful, the ground that held everything. Gerald would have been very pleased, she said. With all of it, Benjamin agreed. With all of it, she said. He pressed his thumb gently across the pocket that held the portrait, the gesture of 3 years of habit that had never quite left him. And the afternoon light went long across the hill country, and the woman beside him was alive and real and entirely present, nothing like the painted image and everything like the essential truth of it. And Benjamin Reed, who had ridden south with a portrait in his pocket and hope in the place where certainty had not yet arrived, sat in the life he had been moving toward all along and found it was exactly what it had always promised to be: complete, continuous, and very good.